I heard the news recently that Netflix has plans to adapt the Chronicles of Narnia into a bingeable TV series, and at first I was cautiously optimistic until I heard that they were patterning it off of Game of Thrones. There's probably still reason to be cautiously optimistic. Many of the creatives on the show previously worked on Pixar movies, which I think is a pretty good precedent, but I kind of wanted to talk about what has made previous Narnia adaptations good and bad, and what could make this one really good if they do it right. Forgot to turn on this light. I went back and rewatched the previous 3 Narnia movies, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, and Dawn Treader, and they were simultaneously better and worse than I remembered. Better in the sense that the prosthetics are really good, the effects are really good, that lion still looks good, the music is great, the casting is perfect, but then worse in the sense that they just don't feel particularly memorable. The plots feel kind of slapped together, the fantasy elements are very generic, and the attempts at world building often come off pretty flat. I do maintain, though, that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe remains a really good adaptation of the source material. I think it captures the tone, I think it captures the spirit of the book, and the characters remain extremely iconic to this day. Rewatching that first film, it did get me thinking, though. I think one of the reasons that the first movie works so well is that it's told primarily from the perspective of the kids, and the kids are sort of the newcomers to Narnia. They don't know anything about it. And because of that, I think the first movie has a lot more wonder to it, and a lot more joy, and a lot more amazement, and a lot more surprises in the world, because we're all seeing it for the first time, and the characters are too. The Narnia franchise is a very interesting one in the books and in the movies, because unlike something like The Lord of the Rings, which is a franchise in which it's a self-contained fantasy world, there are no visitors from outside, right? In Narnia, you constantly have visitors from Earth visiting this fantasy world. And that's kind of the basis of the series in general. And they do some really interesting stuff with that towards the end of the book series. So I think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe works the best out of the 3 movies because it's the one that leans into that outsider aspect the most. It's kind of like Alice in Wonderland, right? Where it's a movie where a child falls into a fantasy realm and not quite everything makes sense. And then at the end, they almost wake up from that dream and come back to the real world. And because of that, it has this strong sense of wonder to it, this strong sense of childlike amazement that the next 2 movies don't really quite have. And I think the reason for that is that the next 2 movies, unlike the first one, really start leaning into the lore of Narnia and the self-consistent world within it. Lore and mythology and world building were never all that important to C.S. Lewis, and that's why he got into many conflicts with J.R.R. Tolkien, because Tolkien was obsessed with a self-consistent universe with its own mythology and history, and Lewis really saw his universe as more of a vehicle for childlike amazement and fantasy. I think that first movie functions a lot better than the other 2 because Narnia primarily serves a purpose of this amazing, wondrous place that the children have visited that doesn't always make sense. And I think the problems run in when you try to start making sense of it, right? And that's what when Netflix compared their approach to Narnia to Game of Thrones, that's what I get a little bit nervous about, because I go, Game of Thrones is one of those universes that is meant to be very grounded, it's meant to make a lot of sense, it's meant to have a self-consistent lore and mythology and characters and history, and Narnia really has never been that. Some of the rumors about how Netflix is approaching the source material have said that they want to do sort of spin-off series about Reepicheep the Mouse and Prince Caspian's son, Rilian, and kings and queens and castles and knights and battles, and that stuff is in Narnia, but I would say it's both the least interesting stuff and the least important stuff. At its core, Narnia is a series about kids and for kids. And yes, I think adults can absolutely appreciate it. I think that I've learned to appreciate Narnia more now that I'm older than I did when I was young. But at the same time, you can't lose that childlike sense of wonder and sacrifice it for some sort of generic fantasy epicness in the vein of Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings. It's just not that. So we've talked a lot about what Narnia is not, right? The things that it shouldn't be when you adapt that source material. But if you ask me what Narnia really is, I would say it's a lot cooler and stranger than the people who have never read the books might ever realize. In order to talk about the Chronicles of Narnia, you do have to talk about the influence of C.S. Lewis's faith on the source material, which I always found as a kid to be wildly ham-fisted. Even when I was like 7 years old, I was like, all right, I get it. Aslan is Jesus, and he gets crucified in the first book, and then he resurrects, and so it's all Jesus parable. I get it, it's an allegory. The funny thing about Narnia, though, is that as I've gotten older, I've realized that it's not an allegory. Narnia is frequently talked about as this classic example of an allegory. You know, it's got an obvious representative for Jesus in the story, and it's got different things that parallel the story of Jesus and other Christian ideals. And obviously, C.S. Lewis was just using it to preach his message into kids, and that was the whole point of it, right? But if you really read the Chronicles of Narnia in depth, there are elements that parallel the story of Jesus, and obviously Aslan is meant to be a Jesus representative. But there are many elements that don't line up particularly with the Christian story, the Christian narrative. And they sort of seem like, well, there's truth in that, but it's not like, oh, this was meant to parallel this thing in the Bible. The basis of the Chronicles of Narnia series is a lot more sci-fi than people realize. C.S. Lewis was always obsessed with other worlds. And especially at the time that he was writing, we were talking all about, you know, when is mankind going to visit Mars? And the idea of space travel was still this new idea that people were comprehending. And for him as a Christian, there was always this question of, all right, so if we find aliens, intelligent life on another planet, will that change the way that I view God and the Christian ideals that I live by? He wrote one book that really wrestles with that question, and it's a lot more sci-fi. It's called the Space Trilogy. The first book is Out of the Silent Planet. And that one is really all about space travel and finding intelligent life and what that means for the meaning of God and Christianity and all this kind of stuff. But then Narnia, the thing that people don't know, actually wrestles with that question in a very similar way, just in a lot more subtle terms. Narnia is not actually an allegory. The basis for the series and why Lewis wrote it was that he wanted to ask one what-if question. And the what-if was, what if there was another world, a fantasy world that was totally different than ours? How would the Christian God insert himself into that world? If we believe, as Christians, and Lewis believed that Jesus was the insertion of God into human history, he was making himself known in human form, how would God do that in a world that was totally different? What form would he take? And Lewis really saw that as, in this particular fantasy universe that I have dreamed up, I think God would take the form of a lion. So in a sense, and I don't know if this is going to make the series better or worse for you, Aslan does not just represent Jesus, he actually is Jesus. And in fact, even in the movies, he tells the kids, I have another name in your world, and you need to find it for yourself. So the Narnia series is based on the question of, what if there was another fantasy world totally different from ours? How would the Christian God make himself known, reveal himself in that world? But then there's also the second what if, which is also, then, what if human beings from our world, from Earth, intersected this alternate world and influenced the history of it? And that's where the Narnia series has a whole lot more multiverse ideas in it than you might realize. In The Magician's Nephew, which is the prequel book that starts it all, there's actually a location called the Wood Between Worlds, and it's basically like this realm of portals that take you to all the different worlds that exist in the known universe in this dimension, and Aslan has made himself known in all of those different worlds in different ways and different forms, and it's fascinating. So Narnia is not a self-contained universe like Lord of the Rings, but it's also not quite a universe like Alice in Wonderland either, because Wonderland in Alice in Wonderland is sort of, it exists regardless of what Alice does. She doesn't particularly influence it, right? But in the Chronicles of Narnia, you actually have this fantasy world where children from our Earth, daughters of Eve and sons of Adam, as they're called in the series, have been brought over to genuinely shape the story of this other universe. And there's plenty of subtle and not so subtle Christian metaphor in that, right? The idea that we're sons and daughters of God, that we're invited into his new creation, that we're citizens of heaven, all that kind of stuff. It really plays out in a rich way in the series. But regardless of that, the humans of Earth have this massive influence over the story of Narnia. Actually, in The Magician's Nephew, the first book, the first king and queens of Narnia are this random taxi cabbie and his wife who happen to fall into a portal that brings them there. Actually, I think it's said in maybe Prince Caspian or The Last Battle that the enemy kingdom of men, who is always waging war against Aslan and sort of is the enemy throughout lots of the series, they started out as pirates from Earth who accidentally stumbled into a portal to Narnia and became this race of men who hated Aslan. So needless to say, this is not your typical Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones fantasy universe. It's really weird. It's got some multiverse stuff. It's got some spiritual stuff. It has some crazy elements of worlds colliding, and yet I also think that there are many reasons it's perfect material for a Netflix show and could make a really good cinematic universe if you do it right. One of the interesting things about the Chronicles of Narnia series that I think is very suited for a cinematic universe format is the fact that it's constantly jumping around in its own timeline. We see different characters at different points in their life, and that all stems from the fact that whenever a character from Earth enters Narnia, they wind up at a different point in the timeline. So when the children leave Narnia at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then they return at the start of Prince Caspian, only like 2 years have passed for them, but 1,000 years have passed in Narnia, and they've become these legends of history and ancient myth. But then when some of the kids leave Narnia at the end of Prince Caspian and they come back at the start of Dawn Treader, only like a couple years have passed in Narnia time. One of the more underrated installments in the Narnia series, The Horse and His Boy, focuses on a new character, but it is set during the reign of King Peter and King Edmund and Queen Susan and Queen Lucy from the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so they're sort of peripheral to the story, but we do get to see them as adults, which is fun, before eventually they go back through the wardrobe and they become kids again at the end of that book. That sort of timeline jumping element, I think, is really satisfying for the cinematic universe format because it allows people to see their favorite characters at different points in their life. And it reminds me almost of the Avengers Endgame time travel sequence, that part of the movie, because it had that same level of crowd-pleasing satisfaction, right? Like, oh, I remember when they were there, and so they were doing that at this time, and, you know, sort of elaborating on different points in the history of the universe and what our characters were doing in those moments. That is not the only Avengers Endgame comparison, though, because The Last Battle is my favorite book in the Narnia series, and it's the one that I've always been dying to see adapted in a better cinematic format. And it is totally the endgame of the Narnia world, right? All your favorite characters from throughout the whole series come back and they fight a big battle, and there's a lot of crowd-pleasing moments in that. And then eventually there's an ending to the series that is really satisfying. So I really feel like the Chronicles of Narnia could make an extremely interesting Netflix show if they lean into the weirdness. You know, this is a universe where the Greek god of wine is there for some reason. Santa Claus is there for some reason. There's a whole world beneath the crust of the earth. It's a flat earth. I forgot to mention that. Father Time exists. He's a massive creature who eventually crushes the sun at the end of the universe. Narnia is an extremely fantastical, abstract, bizarre universe with loads of timeline jumping and memorable, wacky characters and fun mythology that doesn't take itself too seriously, and multiverse stuff, and a really good lion. And I would really love to see it adapted into a series that doesn't take itself too seriously, doesn't lean into that Game of Thrones grim, dark fantasy stuff, but leans more into that childlike wonder that has made the series so successful after all these years. In some ways, I have thought in the past that animation might be the key to doing this. You know, I would really love to see a Narnia series that, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, I just thought of this, what if it started in live action and then when they go into Narnia, it's animation? That could be really cool. But I would love something that is able to lean into the more abstract universe, abstract imagery in a sort of Alice in Wonderland type of way without, you know, I think when things lean into live action, there's a sense in which they have to be tangible. It has to feel real. It has to feel grounded. And this universe really shouldn't feel that way. The one character who appears in all 7 Narnia books is Aslan. And that kind of makes sense given the spiritual context of the series. I would say Aslan is almost like the Nick Fury of the Narnia universe, you know? But I would say that if you're adapting the Narnia series into Netflix or into more films or whatever, Aslan still has to be the key, the glue between all of the stories. You know, you can't tell a Narnia story without Aslan. And I really do think that his character is what gives the whole series its sense of wonder, its sense of childlike faith, its sense of imagination, and he has to be central to whatever story is told. Overall, I would say that despite the Game of Thrones comparison, I'm still cautiously optimistic and kind of excited to see what they do. Like I said, I think the creative team is pretty good behind this, so I have some faith in them. But really, this was an excuse for me to talk about Narnia, which is always fun. People don't talk about Narnia very much, and I always think it's fun to reminisce about these movies that many of us grew up with, but also talk about how maybe the books could be adapted better in the future. So thanks for sticking around. If you have read Narnia, what is your favorite book in the series? I'd love to hear that. And if you haven't, what's your favorite quote from the movies, I guess? I'm just trying to get some engagement from the comments, you know, that's what makes these videos take off. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I have a Patreon if you want to check that out. It has early access to videos and information about the docu-series I'm working on and plenty of other stuff, so, you know, chuck in a buck if you've got that. Either way, I am really glad that you're here and part of this discussion. That's always the fun part anyway, so I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.